Welcome back to Learning Unity with the 3D Game Kit. In this video, we're taking the next steps in our 3D asset creation journey by creating a high poly detail mesh. This high resolution model will allow us to project detail information onto our game-ready mesh later in the pipeline. We'll go over techniques for refining the blockout, adding details, and preparing the high poly model for baking. So let's jump right in and get started bringing our asset to life. Where we left off was in this sort of refined blockout state where our object has the correct forms, the correct shapes, the correct structures. What we need to do now is we need to make it so we can create some high poly detail of the various forms that we have inside of here, like these panels, all this information. Now, you might be thinking, is that something that we should be modeling into the game mesh? And it really kind of depends. If you're going for a higher end game, like a console, higher end, latest gen console, or maybe a high end PC game, absolutely. You could model that geometry in and it's not going to affect a thing. But I want to take this from the perspective of a lower end game, something like a mobile game, so that way we get a little bit more experience with the baking process and you guys can really see it. Now, the first thing I like to do is take my blockout mesh here. I like to go ahead and throw this in a group, so I'm just going to hit Control-G, name this blockout, and then come over here and put it on a layer. And I'll go ahead and just name this our blockout mesh. And the reason why I'm doing this is we want to keep this. The reason we want to keep this is we can likely use this as our game mesh. There are some adjustments that we can probably make before we consider this a game mesh, but this is going to be a lot closer to the game mesh than our high poly mesh. The other thing is we want to use this as a base. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this block out now, just hit Control-D, and I'm going to remove these from their group. I'm just going to select them and hit Shift-P and delete that block out. And now the block out, I should be able to toggle visibility on here for this block out group, and it goes away, but our other objects stay. And I'll go ahead and set this block out to a T for template. That way we can make sure that they're staying close if we need to, but I'll go ahead and turn off its visibility. Now, let's get started with the hard part here, which is going to be our main panel. There's a couple things going on with our main panel. First off, front and back, we're going to want to have those indentations. So one thing I can do very early on is I can actually come in here with my multi-cut tool here. I can add an edge loop, and I can just turn this into a center line. Now, to do that, I'm going to double-click the edge loop. I'm going to hit R to scale and just flatten that, and then hold X to snap to grid. Now, with that in place, I can actually delete the backside of this, so that way we can mirror this across Z later, and we can get that detail we model into the front onto the back. So one of the first things I want to do is look at the topology that we're going to need. Topology is the wireframe, for those of you who aren't familiar. And what we're going to need is we're going to need to find a way to basically extrude this area inward to get this outer ledge. And then we're going to need to find a way to kind of pull this out and push this down. So we can kind of plan this out and add edge loops as we go and just kind of see where we get. Every modeling process a bit different. So let's start with that. Now, one thing that's kind of obvious is I can do an extrude to get this inner edge loop. And I'm probably going to do that initially. And then we can figure out the rest as we go. So I'll start off by coming into face mode here and selecting these. So I can highlight these in face mode. I can just shift click these front faces so we get all of them here. And if I come into my extrude tool, I can go to edit mesh extrude. We can utilize the scaling here to just scale these in to create the inner topology we're going to need for this area. Now, it's okay if this isn't exact because I can come here into edge mode and we can start moving them into place. I want to keep this flat though, because ultimately what we're going to do is we're going to use this as a base to extrude later. So let me flatten these out and just kind of pull them into position here so they match up with our concept. Now, some of these areas like here, I might debate if I want to try and collapse these into a single edge. And we can probably do that here because using bevels, we can make this work. So I'm going to target weld this to here. So that way it's matching up to that area. In which case I do need to take this entire edge here and I do need to pull this forward to kind of match up with that inner point a little bit more. And I'll go ahead and move this one up so that we're getting the correct angle here coming down. And then we can start playing around with these ones, moving this one forward. Now, rather than moving this one forward, I'm going to move these all together forward because these are forming a ledge here, and we can move those into place. Now, as far as these go here, I'm just going to tidy up the vertices here by highlighting them all with the marquee select and scaling them down. And that's going to give us that base. Now, we need to figure out how we're going to get this structure in here and extruded. And this is where something like the multi-cut tool can really accelerate and be quite useful. If I come into the multi-cut, I can attach a vertex here to this point and click to this point. Then I can come up to this point, and then I can connect back into here. Then to resolve this into a series of quads and triangles, I can just connect these back into here, so these have the correct supports. Like so. Now with those in place, I'm going to just tidy up my topology here a little bit to match. So we're going to get those ledges to match more closely. I'll do the same here. I can take this front edge here and scale it forward, so this way it flattens nicely. And just kind of move it in. And then this back ledge here, I might move back a bit to match up more with the ledge we're seeing here. And we can just take some time here now adjusting these. Over here, I might go ahead and pull this in. It doesn't really matter too much, but it's nice to keep things as even as possible, just so they look clean in terms of the topology. So with that in place, we're pretty much good to go in terms of extruding this. The only thing I might want to play around with is areas like this that seem to be a little bit off here. I could put this exactly here, but I think that's like a smoothing artifact, so I'm going to keep this where it is if possible. And ours may be more or less precise than our reference. But with all of those in place, what I can do now is I can come into here and select these faces, and we can extrude these down to get that inner area. Now, a quick way to extrude, like I mentioned in a previous video, is just taking what we have here, and we can push in with this with Shift, but I might want to push in and scale this in to create that sort of offset we see here. And that's a nice technique in games when you're creating a normal map, so you don't necessarily have to add extra geometry. So in that instance, I'd want to come in here to the Edit Mesh Extrude, because what that's going to allow me to do is push this in. And then if I click this little toggle here, well, actually, I don't even need to click that toggle. I can move into the scale mode here. So you can click these squares to go into scale, and then you can scale this in. Now, if it's not quite giving you what you want, you can click this toggle here to switch the space it's scaling in, and we could go ahead and scale in with that space, or we could just manually adjust it, which I think we're ultimately going to have to do. I could, maybe do some adjusting here with X, though. If I do this with X, it'll look a little bit better, but we can come in now and we can just move these manually and kind of match up that bevel we're seeing in our concept here. So I'll match this here, and we can just go, piece by piece here, get these to match as good as possible. So get these to come out at more of an angle, move them forward a bit probably, or just down. That looks nice. Then I can come into here, pull this one up, like so. And then we can do the same with this little inward dent here. We can pull this forward to get this nice looking bevel at the top. And I'm just going to try and match the thicknesses on the 3D model more closely. And it does look like maybe this was shifted, but leaving that unshifted would probably be more accurate. But something like that is going to give us that inner bevel that we need. Now, the next thing we would want to do to this is add in some micro bevels, so that way it can kind of hold the form in detail. But that's going to be stage 1, is getting to this point. And ultimately, the final stage we want to get to is when we press 3 and smooth this, it all smooths out nicely. So we have a ways to go. But let's go ahead and explore adding in those micro bevels next. But take some time getting to this point, refining these, finessing the wireframe, and before you do, really look it over. Make sure it's looking the way you want. And of course, a good practice at this stage would also be to hit the save button, so that way you don't lose any data if you do have something that you do like here. I'm going to move that up slightly. So take a little bit more time with it. Make sure it is to your liking. There's a lot of ways we can add in these smoothing edges, but the way that I prefer with something like this is to simply use a bevel. as much as possible. You can do this before or after you mirror, which is another thing to point out. And we also might want to adjust the depth of this before we do. The depth of this can affect how it looks in the normal map. This is pretty deep. I might want to make this a bit more shallow. If I do, though, I want to just double check that it's not affecting the orthographics there. But I don't think this would be a super deep panel. It'd probably just be kind of light and on the surface like that. So that way we just get a little bit of indentation. Now, when it comes to adding in these bevels, you basically want to look for where you want the edges to hold and to be sharp. And you can actually do a preview of this first using something like the crease tool to figure out which edges need to be done. When it comes to hard surfaces like this, I'll often use that just to kind of explore. So the way the crease tool works is you can find an edge you want to be hard, like this one here. We want to hold that angle. You can come up here to the mesh tools, and there's this option in here called the crease tool right at the top. What that does is it makes it so you can middle mouse drag, and what this is essentially going to do is add an edge loop here, as if we had an edge on the top and an edge on the bottom. So when you press 3, you can see how that looks. Now, in many cases, we can actually use this in place of something like a bevel, which we might do in this project if it holds up okay. So what I'll do now is I'll come through and double click the outer edges here that I know I want to hold up and to have these bevels on. This inner structure here, all of this stuff, I know I'm going to want to have this to be creased. This ledge here, this ledge here. As a matter of fact, most of this probably can be, if not the whole thing, now that I'm looking at it. Now that makes things a lot easier for us. Usually it's when you have like round transitions that's, you start to get some weird stuff. But because this has no round edges and everything's hard, we could potentially just crease all the geometry and not have any issues. Which brings up a good point that we could actually use the bevel tool universally on here. So let's just go ahead and try out the crease tool here, crease that whole thing, and just see if there's any weird artifacts. And at the end of it, there really isn't. You can see the crease tool doesn't quite hold up that great. That's the reason you might want to use bevels instead. I like to think of it as more of a temporary thing. One thing is we do need to make sure we crease these inner edges here to make it hold. But I think with that in mind, we can actually just bevel this whole thing, and we can actually cheat this a little bit and not have to worry about it. So that makes me excited because it makes it a lot easier to do the next step, which would be to mirror this back and basically just use the bevel tool. So since we have this already centered here, should be good to go. We can just come into our mesh. We can use a mirror like we did previously, but this time we're going to do Z minus in 0.001, so we're going backwards. And this will give me this front and back. Now, if I wanted to make the front and back UVs the same, I could keep the center line for UV splitting, so there's a middle part. I don't really want to, though, so I'm going to take that center line and just edit mesh and delete edge and vertex on that. But with this in place, since we now know that the whole thing can support edge loops, we could just bevel this in object mode. So I could come up here to our edit mesh, bevel, just click this in object mode. I'm going to turn on X-ray so we can see this, and I'll just give it a segment of 2, and then a relatively small fraction, so we get nice sharp mechanical edges. And we can press 3 and check if there's any issues. And it doesn't look like there is, so this should produce a really nice bevel mesh for us to use as our base for baking our normal map and things like our curvature. Now, to double check this, you can assign a material. So I'll go to assign favorite and just assign a blend here. And this blend will allow us to kind of check the shininess. Since this is Maya 2025, I might actually want to come in here and assign a standard surface here. So a standard surface. That way we can kind of get a better read on it. And you can see here we are getting a little bit of weirdness. So I don't know if you can see that. Where these are kind of converging. That's an area that maybe we don't necessarily want those edges in. So I could come back here and undo this bevel. We could come into edge mode instead. And in here I could deselect some of these that I might deem unnecessary. So instead of getting a pull there, maybe we just get these and see if this gives us a better result. Now you notice I am leaving these. This will create an n-gon. We don't care about n-gons for the high poly. So we can come in here now and just use that bevel again. This time without that area, I'm going to go to segments 2, and we can adjust the fraction. I actually kind of like this fraction, but I'm going to base it on this area since this area is probably the most problematic. And maybe I don't want it super tight, maybe just something like that. And I can press 3 now, and you'll see if I'm looking at this shine, that area doesn't have too many issues, but we are running into a mild issue here with those kind of pulling up. So we can make some adjustments here. We do need to keep this, outside edge kind of going the way it is. We do need to keep that. But we could play around with collapsing these on each other by using something like a target weld and just welding these together into a single point. That way we're not getting a floating n-gon. I'll do the same over here. And we can see if that gives us an okay end result in terms of the smoothing. So let's just press 3, and that looks okay. So you want to look over your object for any blemishes, but at this point, I think we can call this particular post high poly pass done. So I'm going to name this one. I'll just name this side rail or side post, HP for high poly, and there you go. Actually, we might use a different naming convention later. We'll keep that one for now to keep things simple. But that looks pretty good. I don't see any major issues with that. So let's go ahead and move to our little panels here. These ones will be a lot quicker because their form's already ready for us. We'll just kind of bevel those, but that will get our big form done. So if we come into these guys, we can go ahead and adjust these. Now, we actually don't need to smooth all of them. We can just do one and call it good. But I'll go ahead and isolate this guy, and these ones are pretty straightforward. We're just going to hit up the outer edges, hit up the corners, and we're going to be good. So in this instance, I'm going to go into edge mode. I'm just going to double-click the edges that I want to have in their entirety here, which are going to be our border edges running around the outside, tops and bottoms, and then the round area we don't want to touch, but these corners we're going to want to get a nice bevel to. And that's pretty much going to do the trick. So once we have all the edges we like selected, we can just come up here to Edit Mesh Bevel, segments to 2, and give it a nice tight amount of segments here. So when we press 3, we get this beautiful end result that smooths out nicely and gives us those bevel edges, which is mainly what we're going for in the bake. All right, now I don't really need to repeat that because like I mentioned, we can just go ahead and bring this down to the next one. It looks like the vertex is already kind of at a base point there, so if I Control D and snap to vertex, I should be able to position this right where it needs to be in correlation to this object, and then hit delete, and then do the same thing coming down into here, and then hit delete. And as far as this little guy goes, we don't need to change this one. This is perfectly fine for our high poly, so at this stage, we could consider this pretty much done. Now, there is a final step to this that we need to do to consider this ready to go into a baking program, and that's to move this from Smooth Mesh Preview to actually Smooth Mesh. Now, you usually want to save out an iteration before doing this, so I'm going to go to LaserGate 01, and I might give this something more descriptive, like HP Smooth Preview, and I'll put 02 because I know it's the second in the segment, but that will make it so if I need to come back to this, I'm aware, because the next stage is kind of the point of no return. What we're going to do is we're going to turn this smooth preview into physical polygons. And the reason we need to do that is when we go to use baking software like Substance Painter or XNormal that isn't in Maya, it can't carry the smooth preview detail into there. It's just going to look at the unsmoothed mesh, which would still hold up pretty nicely because we used bevels. You can see the difference between this and this is actually not a lot. So in theory, this would work fine, just so you guys know. But this has a little bit nice smoother edges, so I'm going to use it. But it would use that instead of our actually smooth preview. So to convert a smooth preview to polygons, you can make sure you have smooth preview turned on, which is 3. You can come up here to modify, convert, and you can select smooth mesh preview to polygons. And once you click that, what it's going to do is it's going to take the smooth mesh preview and it's going to turn it into polygons. Now I want to show you guys a significant aspect here of why that's important. The reason that's important is, remember that area I said we don't care if we have n-gons? Well, when you do smooth mesh preview, it subdivides and it resolves all of these into quads or triangles. Now, alternatively, if you guys didn't want to do a convert smooth mesh preview to polygon, how could you get rid of those n-gons? You can come up here to mesh and select triangulate, and that will resolve any n-gons into triangles. So that's the way you could use this one as a bake, or you could do the modify convert smooth mesh preview to polygons if you want to have that smooth detail. Now we can do this exact same process on these with 3 pressed. We can just go ahead and hit G to repeat, since that was the last command I used, and I can go through and do that to each of these. Because this one's not making use of smooth mesh preview, we can leave this be. I am still going to keep this in here for the sake of the bake, but as far as everything else goes, these are good to go. So we can now go ahead and highlight all of these. We can delete their history, edit, delete all by type history, modify freeze transforms. That way we clear out their stack here and it's good to go. And I'm just going to hit Control G and I'm going to name this high poly. So that way we have this to use as a reference when we start building out our game mesh. So let's make sure we save. I'm going to save as a different iteration. I'm just going to make this our HP smoothed, add an ED, smooth, and then make this O3. Okay, so that's going to be the process of making our high poly. You can still see we have our blockout mesh there and it's correlating wireframe. But remember, our blockout mesh, if we just take a look at that, doesn't have all those nice bevel details and it's not catching the light. So we're not going to get any of that in the normal map unless we utilize the high poly, which we just went ahead and created, that you can see has all those details. So that's going to be it for today's tutorial on creating the high poly detail mesh. You've learned how to refine your blockout and add fine details that will project onto your low poly game mesh later. And the next video, we'll move on to optimizing this model and preparing it for baking and texturing by creating our game mesh, our initial game mesh. If you are finding these lessons helpful, be sure to like and comment and subscribe so you don't miss the next step in the process. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.